Black boy helps woman fix her TV. Next day, she shows up at her house with the police. In the quiet neighborhood of St. Grace, where the streets were lined with oak trees and the houses wore the charm of decades past, lived a kind-hearted teenager named Walter. At 16, he was known for his warm smile, infectious laughter, and a willingness to help anyone in need. He often spent his afternoons volunteering at the local community center, tutoring younger kids and organizing events. One sunny afternoon, as Walter was walking home from the center, he noticed Mrs. Ken, an elderly woman who lived alone 2 doors down. She was struggling with her television, her frail hands fumbling with the remote control. The screen flickered with static, and her frustration was palpable. "Hey, Mrs. Ken, need some help?" Walter called out, jogging over to her porch. "Oh, Walter, dear, it's this confounded TV again. I just want to watch my stories," she exclaimed, her voice tinged with exasperation. Walter chuckled. "Let's see what we can do." He settled down next to her, taking the remote from her hand. After a few minutes of troubleshooting, he discovered that the issue was simply a disconnected cable. With a few deft movements, he had the television working again. "There you go, all fixed," he said, beaming at her. "Oh, thank you, thank you. You're such a good boy," Mrs. Ken said, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. "You saved my afternoon." Walter waved off her praise. "Just doing what I can, Mrs. Ken. Enjoy your shows." He stood up, waved goodbye, and headed home, feeling a warm glow of satisfaction. The next day, Walter was lounging in his room, headphones on and music playing, when he heard a knock at the door. His mother answered, and he could hear muffled voices. Curious, he pulled off his headphones and walked into the living room. To his shock, he saw 2 police officers standing at the door, their serious expressions contrasting sharply with the sunny day outside. Walter's heart raced as he approached. "Good afternoon, ma'am," one of the officers said to his mother. "We're here to speak with Walter." "What's this about?" his mother asked, concern etching her features. The officer turned to Walter. "Can we talk to you for a moment, son?" Sure," Walter replied, his mind racing with confusion. Had he done something wrong? He followed the officers outside, where they stood in the shade of a large oak tree. "Walter, we received a report from Mrs. Ken," the officer began, his tone serious. "She said you broke into her home yesterday." "What?" "No, I helped fix her TV," Walter protested, bewildered. The officers exchanged glances, and the second officer spoke up. "She claims you entered her house without permission. We need to take her statement." Walter felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. "I would never do that. I was just helping her." As the officers continued to question him, Walter's mind raced. How could Mrs. Ken have misunderstood his intentions? He thought back to their interaction. She'd seemed so grateful, so appreciative. "Can I talk to her?" Walter asked, desperation creeping into his voice. The officers looked at each other and nodded. "We'll take you to her, but remember, this is serious." They drove him to Mrs. Ken's house, and as they arrived, Walter's heart sank. He felt a mix of anxiety and determination. He had to clear this up. When they entered her home, Mrs. Ken was sitting in her living room, looking frail and worried. Her eyes widened when she saw Walter. "Oh, dear, what's happening?" "Mrs. Ken, I'm sorry," Walter said, stepping forward. "I didn't break in. I was just helping you with your TV." The officers listened intently as Mrs. Ken looked between Walter and the officers. I thought he was trying to take something. I was confused. I'm so sorry, Walter." Walter felt a rush of relief mixed with anger. "You scared me. I would never do that to you." Mrs. Ken's face softened with regret. "I know, dear. I'm so sorry. I just panicked. I've been feeling so lonely and vulnerable lately." The officers exchanged a look, and the first officer spoke again. "It seems there was a misunderstanding. We'll take your statement, Mrs. Ken, but it looks like this is a case of miscommunication." "Walter, I truly am sorry. You were only trying to help me," she said, her voice trembling. "It's okay, Mrs. Ken. Just remember I'm here to help, not to hurt," Walter replied, his heart softening. From that day on, their bond grew stronger. Walter continued to check in on her regularly, and Mrs. Ken learned to trust him. In the end, a misunderstanding turned into an opportunity for connection, reminding them both of the importance of kindness and communication in their community.